Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Thought Leader Roundtable, a conversation on readiness. Today is part of a regular series of explorations of the key questions of what does it mean for all young people to be ready for life's demands at every stage, and what is it going to take for us to get there? Karen Pittman, CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment, usually leads lively and candid conversations with some of the most influential boundary-pushing leaders working to improve the lives of children and young people across the U.S. The reason why I say usually is because today we have a special treat. Instead of being the interviewer, Karen will be sitting on the other side of the microphone. Karen and our colleague Priscilla Little will be interviewed by the Forum's co-founder Marita Irby as they reflect on the work of the Aspen Institute National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development and its Youth Development Work Group. The work group's efforts are summarized in the recently released brief authored by Priscilla and Karen, titled Building Partnerships in Support of Where, When, How Learning Happens. A little bit about our presenters today. Our moderator today will be Marita Irby, who is Chief Architect of the Forum and is Managing Director of Big Picture Approach Consulting, the Forum's division dedicated to building the capacity of partnerships and coalitions. As a coach for Ready by 21 Changemakers, Marita works with key leaders from school districts, governmental departments, community collaboratives, and non-governmental organizations nationwide. Marita began her career as a classroom teacher in Central American inner-city schools in the U.S. and moved on to being a senior research associate at Stanford University, where she worked on a 5-year study of community-based urban youth organizations. Karen Pittman is president and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment and is a respected sociologist and leader in youth development. Prior to co-founding the Forum in 1998, she launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as Senior Vice President at the International Youth Foundation. Priscilla Little is BPA consultant with the Forum. She has been working in the education arena and conducting educational research for over 20 years. She is a member of the Forum for Youth Investment's Big Picture Approach Consulting Group, building its capacity to support multi-site strategic alignment and partnership initiatives, including performance partnership pilots. Prior to becoming a consultant, she was at the Harvard Family Research Project, where she led research teams to investigate policy-relevant after-school issues such as improving participation, addressing program quality, building after-school systems, and supporting expanded learning partnerships. There are only a handful of slides for today's session. We'll be accepting questions and comments via the chat feature on today's session, which is available at the top or bottom of your screen. Today's session is being recorded. Early next week, it will be sent to everyone who registered and also posted to the Ready by 21 website, along with any additional resources that are mentioned. If you happen to be active on Twitter, please feel free to tweet about today's session using the hashtag ReadyYouth. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Marita.
Thank you, Ian. I am thrilled and excited to be having this conversation today with two of my favorite people. And hopefully we can keep it as lively and candid as these conversations usually are. I'm sure Karen will be quite frank as we chat our way through this, and I know Priscilla will as well. So delighted that you all have been able to join us today. And I think I'll turn to Karen, just have you kind of kick us off a little bit with what is this Commission on Social, Emotional, Academic Development, and why did you sign up to be a commissioner in the first place?
I think, well, the commission is about to end its work. It was set up about 2 years ago, and the commission was really set up to really look at how this idea of integrating social, emotional, and academic development can be more fully and intentionally embedded in schools, in the pre-K through 12 school systems, building on the momentum that's been happening across the country, the recognition that this is a critically important issue, and the language around social, emotional, and academic development was very intentional. That the next phase of what needed to be happening was not just school systems selecting an SEL curriculum, but really understanding how to fully understand and build on the research that's been coming out about how learning happens, that we really have to integrate social and emotional learning and create context for social and emotional learning as the backdrop for how all learning happens, including academic development. So it was really a commission set up to make sure we're bringing in the wealth of new research about how learning happens and about the importance of setting up context into the practice space with K-12 educators, and then linking it also to the policy space to make sure that we're doing everything that we can at the federal, but certainly at the state level, which is where the commission has been focused, to really support the advancement of these ideas. So an exciting commission to have set up to really sort of codify and formalize work that's been happening across the country. And then there were 25 commissioners who were selected to really be a part of this process and guide the process, which then had a bunch of work groups and learning groups associated with it.
Yeah, so tell us just a little bit more about that. What was your role as a commissioner, and what were these different ways of operating inside the commission?
The commission had committees or working groups on research, on policy, on practice, and these were really bringing together a council of distinguished educators, a council of distinguished scientists, who were really focused on bringing everything that we know into those spaces and generating the consensus documents that were going to guide the work through the development of recommendations into implementation. There was also a group set up focused on young people, so we had youth ambassadors to make sure we had youth voice connected to the commission. Parents group was set up, and then finally there was a group set up to really focus on partnership and outreach, to acknowledge that in order to really sort of fully galvanize the focus on K-12, we had to acknowledge the importance of the broader ecosystem. And we can share a little bit more about both of those things.
Yeah, and we'll get to that ecosystem in just a bit. Priscilla, let's get you in here on this. I know you and Karen had opportunities to connect and work closely in some ways over the last couple of years on this, but you really had kind of a different role in connection to the commission. Can you fill us in on that?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. So as the commission was forming, I was transitioning out of the Wallace Foundation, where I'd been an initiative manager for 5 years. And for the past year or so that I was there, they were designing an initiative that would really focus on partnerships between out-of-school time intermediaries and school districts focused on social-emotional learning and how they could partner better together. So thinking about the role that out-of-school time and youth development could play in SEL was in my head coming into this. And I had the opportunity, as I transitioned out of Wallace, to join the Forum for Youth Investment team, supporting and really being the liaison between the work that Aspen was doing and supporting Karen as the co-chair of the Outreach and Coalition Subcommittee. Early on, the commission realized that to be successful, they would need a robust set of partners that would help them move the work forward. So the Outreach and Coalition Building Subcommittee was to develop an outreach strategy and coalition infrastructure of key stakeholders and partner organizations to really fully support integrating social, emotional, and academic development in K-12. And the idea was that having a robust partner coalition would really help carry forward the ideas when the commission sunsetted in 2018. And so we, through a series of meetings and collaborations, worked closely to develop really what we called sort of a partner taxonomy. We looked at all the family members that were part of the NSEED work, and it's not just the commissioners. As Karen said, we had representatives in K-12 and everyone throughout the ecosystem, and Karen will show you that slide in a minute. And from that, we developed a partner collaborative that would represent the many different partners outside of mainstream education. So we're talking about health, human services, juvenile justice, business, youth development. And as we mapped out who the partners currently were that had been invited in, we realized we had some real gaps in both the business community and the youth development sector. And so we moved toward really creating a very robust set of partners that would include those sectors. Over time, we elevated the role of the youth development work group. And I don't know, Marita, if you want to talk about that yet or continue with more general commission stuff.
Yeah, so let's do that. We're gonna kind of take a couple of stair steps and zoom in on this. Let's first say there's a lot of conversations, lots of committees, lots of parallel work, and then the focus really being how do we get some kind of consensus in terms of what we're talking about here. And I know Ian promised you a couple of visuals. I think this ended up being kind of a little bit of a picture drawing group by the end of it, as a way to get people on the same page. So I'm going to actually ask Karen to tell us a little bit about what they came up with in terms of even saying what is social emotional learning and how learning happens.
Yeah, you asked what the commission did, and the commission met, both commissioners were embedded in these committees, and then the commissioners met as a full commission 4 times over the course of, in person, and then virtually also, but in person 4 times so far over the course of the commission's span. And a really important part was, as we were listening to the presentations that were coming back from the Council of Distinguished Scientists, to really get an understanding of what we know about how learning happens, that we asked for visuals. And as a consensus building group, it takes a while to get to visuals that are not connected to any one organization's frame. But I think these are really exciting and important to be able to build. So the first acknowledgement and consensus was really that we understand that learning happens both in the context of having safe and relationship-based learning environments, that we have to actually look at the learning environment as the overall environment, that you're talking about embedding social, emotional, and cognitive skills into all the academic learning, and if we're talking more broadly out in the ecosystem, whatever kind of content is being developed, and then really making sure that we're being explicit about teaching and helping young people practice social and emotional skills. So that some of folks who were familiar with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning, will recognize that understanding and importance of thinking about what could be called climate and culture, as well as explicit instruction, as well as embedding this work in everything. But that was an important piece. The second piece was then to really define the student experience and be explicit about the fact that if we're really going to create supportive environments, the evidence that we've done it well is that young people have a deep sense of belonging and connection to the school community and to their broader community, that they actually are engaged, they're owning the work, they have a sense of purpose, and of course they're really developing the rigorous and engaging with the rigorous academic content and learning experiences. And if you're taking this picture out more broadly, they're engaging with whatever content or skill building work is happening in the environment. And then all of that then leads to the final space, which is what we expect from student outcomes. And that, again, was an important piece for the commission to overall embrace, which is, of course, we want academic success and educational attainment, but if we're doing this right, we're creating learning environments inside schools and out that are contributing to well-being, that are getting young people ready for the workforce and career, and are also reinforcing the importance of civic and community engagement. So as you all see the report from the commission come out and the final report from the nation, this picture of sort of the practice space for how learning happens and what kind of student outcomes that we want to expect was a really important piece of the commission's work, and took a lot of time and a lot of energy to get that many folks from all those perspectives that Priscilla mentioned on board with the same sort of consensus about what the settings look like, how we want to actually assess that students are having the right kind of experiences and engagement to get to a broader set of outcomes.
Now, I've heard both of you talk about, over the course of this work, this sort of flipping the frame a little bit. It's talking about social emotional academic development, social emotional learning, and I've heard the phrase a lot about learning is social and emotional.
Mm-hmm.
What does it do in terms of conversation to really flip that view? Not social emotional learning, but learning is social emotional. Why is that so important?
Yeah, that was an important, thanks for asking that question, Rita, and I think it's really important. Sort of about halfway through the commission's work as we were having these meetings, we had an occasion for some of the commissioners to join with K-12 educators from across the country at Aspen in sort of a retreat setting for several days, looking explicitly at the question of how social emotional learning connects to equity and what that has to do with the education space. And then going through a series of conversations and working with facilitators who really were bringing sort of the equity lens into our discussion, one of the things that happened was we all recognized the power of shifting from talking about social and emotional learning, which if you're in a teaching space, I say social and emotional learning, that means teaching. That means I'm teaching young people these skills. We have to add this into what we're doing to make sure that we're expanding the breadth of what we're teaching. When we just took those words and flipped them and said learning is social and emotional, it gave you a much more direct access to what the research tells us, which we were also hearing, which is what we know now from research from infancy on is that young people, all of us, are social beings. And that if we don't feel socially safe and accepted, or we don't feel emotionally safe, it seriously compromises both our capacity and our motivation to learn whatever is being put in front of us. So flipping it to say learning is social emotional was an easy way to say this isn't really an add-on that we should be thinking of as taking away from academic content or taking away from whatever the primary thing is that we're trying to help young people do. If we're not creating environments in which young people feel socially accepted and emotionally safe, they're not going to engage and learning isn't going to happen. So that flip of language also was very important. And when we come back to talking about the youth development work group was one that we took into that space as well.
Yeah. Let's get to that youth development work group. I'm going to pop up here one other picture, and I think who's the range of folks that needs to get that concept, or maybe it's already working on that in terms of learning is social emotional. This is a pretty complex picture of a pre-K to 12 ecosystem. How did it evolve over time? Yeah, I'll just say, working with both of you, I've seen different versions of this picture over the course of the time period. What was the evolution of this picture?
I mean, the short answer is it evolved pretty quickly. At the first time the commissioners came together, it was very clear that there is a broader ecosystem that is both supporting K-12 education and also putting pressure on K-12 education to change, and are also the folks that will have to help not only influence K-12, but can create the policies that are supported and can create the capacity to implement whatever changes happen. So the broader picture of the K-12 infrastructure it took a while to develop the picture, but the idea that we had to acknowledge in the ecosystem really came out of the first meeting that the commission had. So that didn't take very long. I'm going to segue over to Priscilla if you sort of click and expand. As Priscilla mentioned, what we ended up doing was just really focusing in that complex picture of the ecosystem. There are a range of organizations that actually work directly with young people in their communities that also support learning and development. And it became increasingly important to make sure that sort of as the sort of the next line of defense or another line of defense or opportunity to make sure young people are really building all of their social and emotional skills as they move towards being ready for whatever they're doing next in life, that we needed to not only be pushing information out and acknowledging the importance of those organizations, we needed to really have a much more active understanding of what they do and how they contribute. And so, as Priscilla said, that led to the development of another group, which hadn't been sort of on the radar screen, which was a working group specifically of organizations from that outer ring.
So Priscilla, help us understand who these folks were a little bit that were coming in, because if I understand correctly, the research, the policy, the practice, those teams,
they were named at the beginning.
For a while.
Yeah, those were folks who were named at the beginning. This is a group that we began to sort of cull from the partners who were being recruited, and we also recruited more folks to come in. So and Priscilla, as she mentioned, Priscilla really was the person who worked sort of closely with the commission. As I was the co-chair of this sort of partnership and outreach group, as we looked to really get to these subgroups of folks who were in that ring, Priscilla really worked very closely with the commission staff to bring those folks on board. So you're seeing a wonderful set of logos, and Priscilla, I'll let you talk about that process and who we ended up convening and doing what with them.
So it's sort of a subset of the partner group here. It's a lot of logos. Maybe we're familiar with Priscilla. What was it that sort of helped that brought these folks to the table, and how would you characterize them? How did it sort of hang together? Who was like usually at the table, and who were some new folks?
Yeah, so these are a subset of the partners, but then other voices that haven't been invited in for various reasons. And so the 40 or so organizations that ended up with us were, you can see there many of them are large service providers, some are policy, some are research. And one of the advantages, I think, of having this group is that many of them had networks and affiliates that they worked with. So when we got to pushing ideas out and pulling information back, the feedback and task grew exponentially. So we weren't just getting information from, you know, Gina Warner, for example, at the National After School Association. She had pushed information out to all the affiliates and brought it back to us. So there was real value add in having this group, including some intermediaries. Every Hour Counts was part of it, Sprockets and St. Paul. So we really did try to have networks involved because we really wanted to make sure, in keeping with the Commission's feeling, that the broadest number of people needed to be included in this effort. So I think that worked really well. The group itself started at a pre-meeting in May, and then we formally convened in June of 2018 to begin to chart out our work together. And the two primary tasks were to both give input on the recommendations as they came out from the policy, practice, and research subcommittees, as well as create our own resource that could be used to help K-12 educators understand how youth development organizations could expand and add capacity to schools to support social, emotional, and academic development. And so that's the paper that we're talking about today. The last task, and this one will never be over, is this group and other partners are really going to be tapped to continue to push forward the ideas from the Commission when the report for the nation comes out. So we're hoping that this is a group that will stay together in some fashion to continue to work on the ideas that we have been putting forth.
Yeah, I was lucky to be able to join that meeting back in June, really as a participant on behalf of the forum, but not as the front of the room facilitator of the meeting. And it was really interesting to kind of see the work that was done to really, again, literally get folks on the same page, and the amount of homework that had to be done even coming into that room to understand who was coming in and what their perspectives were, and really how they went about their work. I teed this one up for you and Karen to speak to. I actually went back and looked at that presentation from the June meeting, and you all started with their descriptions of how they do business, for many of them, how they go about doing their work. Why was it important to, and I know we like PowerPoint, Karen, but why was it important to bring all of these pictures and visuals together and take a look with that larger group at how they describe their business?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it was important for two reasons. One, as Priscilla said, the first task that we engaged them in, which they really leaned in and embraced, was the task of reviewing the recommendations that at that point were coming out of the research group, the policy group, and the practice group. And they really were charged with looking at those recommendations to say, do these make sense to you? What would you add to them? How would you connect to them? As this, you know, if these are the kind of recommendations that are going to come out of the group, what advice would you give to make sure we've done as much as possible to make it easy for you to pick these up and use them, and continue to keep the momentum going? So they did a great job of that. But one of the things that came back was, it's great for us to reflect into these recommendations, but we also really want to make sure that outer ring, those organizations that work in communities with young people, and also often work inside the school building with young people, but aren't the formal K-12 sort of hired staff, that those folks really are acknowledged for what they do. And so when we came together, as Priscilla said, in an in-person meeting, what we asked people to do was to share their descriptions of who they were and how they did their work, to make sure that we were introducing everybody through their own language as much as possible about what these organizations have in common. What is the approach that they bring to supporting young people's social and emotional and cognitive development and skill development that they would like to communicate across. And this was just a quick example of the kinds of the kinds of things that people send us is their high-level descriptions of how they do their work. And what you see just very quickly in looking at those is the commonality back to that how learning happens slide and the centrality of basically reinforcing the relationships, the fact that learning is social and emotional. They just wanted to get that across, that when you're talking about organizations and adults who are working with young people primarily voluntarily, leading with relationships is critically important, and it is what they lead with. They don't lead with the content, they lead with relationships. That doesn't mean that they're content-less, but it does mean that in doing their work, they are very focused on that idea that learning is social and emotional, and that if you want to engage young people, you need to pay attention to that.
So it sounds like a pretty intensive process. I know I was, as a participant, contributing in along the way, but Priscilla, you really did some heavy lifting, as I recall, taking in input from lots of different folks, weaving together recommendations. Can you describe, first, I'm curious, like how that was compared to other things like this that you've been a part of, and what do you think the payoff was? What difference did it make for all of these organizations to be involved?
So I had watched the process of collaborative writing and consensus building unfold through the practice subcommittee and the policy subcommittee because I had been supporting Aspen through the partnership work. And so I'd seen the value in having this collaborative consensus building process. And so we applied that to this process. So after the first meeting, we charted out notes and played back themes, and then we started developing outlines. And at every step of the way, I think we had 3 different rounds of feedback and Zoom calls and quite a lot of tracked changes that I refereed, and that was fine. And I think at the end of the day, what you get from that is hopefully the partners that contributed see themselves in this work. And I think if you see yourself in the work, you're more likely to use it and figure out how to push ideas forward. So this was not a paper that was done to someone. This was very much a collaborative paper where hopefully folks who contributed can see themselves in it. And a piece of it, and I wrote this actually in the chat box, in addition to the paper, which we wanted to keep short and fairly pithy. I don't know that we did a great job at that, but it's shorter. It started out being about 30 pages, so it was now down to about 10 by the time it got designed. We left a lot of really rich examples on the cutting room floor, so we put those into an example bank that's also online where you can access the brief, and it's just full of different ways that places have actually implemented some of the recommendations in the paper. So again, I think the value of this collaborative process, although it's hard work. It's hard work to do collaborative writing, pays off because I think more people see themselves in the work.
Yeah, no, I think you should get a medal for the 15 to 20 to 25 people that were giving you comments and truly the track changes and the comment boxes ways and really figuring out how to weave that together in a way that was reflective of the and conveyed, I think, really the top notes of the conversations that everyone was having, and then have that further level of depth that people could tap into. Karen, I'd like you to kind of take us to one of the key ideas that was put on the table through these conversations, and that kind of where, when learning happens, as well as how learning happens. But if you can speak to this, what it was like in this work for you as well with this group, and then show us the kind of payoff visual that came out of this work.
Absolutely. I want to first just reinforce the point that Priscilla made, that one of the real strengths of the commission, and specifically the strength of how the commission process was structured and staffed, was this real focus on active consensus building. And it is hard work. It is time consuming, but I think it has very much paid off, not just in the issue brief on building partnerships, but across the whole suite of issue briefs and reports that the Commission has put out thus far, and there are a lot of them, and you should look at all of them if you can, but also as we're coming into the close of really putting out the final report from the nation, it really has been an incredibly important and I think successful process of engaging lots of folks and really getting deep levels of engagement and advice, and then sending it back to staff, in this case back to us for the Building Partnerships Fund, to really struggle with how do you really build, how do you add in all that advice and add it up.
And I was going to say, it really resonates with me because it's the work that I am privileged to be able to support at the community levels, being able to see how people do that work across systems, cross sectors, to get on the same page and be able to say, this is what we care about for children and youth. But you know, the benefit of doing it at the community level is they're usually pretty co-located, and what it's like to take folks who are working across so many different fields and also geographies and really do something that's for the nation at really, as I was saying, the same level of intensity as I see happening at the community level in these kinds of processes. It was pretty impressive, the commitment, I think, of not just the commissioners, but the kinds of folks that you had in the youth development work group.
So
so show me what kind of netted. I'm going to pop one more visual up here.
So let me explain this one, and then let's then pause and see if there are questions that are coming in. Because I can't
this
see
is really the core of if we say building partnerships in support of where, when, and how learning happens. Well, when and where do learning happen?
Yeah, so very quickly, I think when we brought this group together, again, because of the importance of the work that had already been done by the research group and then validated by the practice group that really sort of talked about and focused on how learning happens, we said we really want to bring some nuance into the conversation of where and when learning happens. And one way to do that is that we'd actually like to push the conversation beyond sort of a high level, well, there's school and there's community, or there's school and there's out of school, or school and after school. When we're really taking that slide about what it takes to support learning, and we're taking that to heart, how do we get a more nuanced view of the settings in which learning happens from a young person's perspective? What does that look like? So we started with that conversation. The first thing that we wanted to acknowledge, which sort of goes across the top of the slide, is that learning does happen everywhere. We know that, but it really does happen in specific contexts in which adults can be and are intentional about helping young people develop the set of skills and competencies. That starts with home, it starts with the family. There's intentionality there that we have to reinforce and support. The work that Learning Heroes has done, for example, to really document what it is that we know families do and want for their young people, suggests the intentionality of acknowledging that families really do think that in this space of sort of helping young people build their social, emotional, and cognitive skills, they really come first. They are the first teachers of these. The second, obviously, is schools. The third is community, not just the amorphous community, but that array of community organizations in settings where adults are creating learning environments and offering learning opportunities and opportunities for development. And then we wanted to at least begin to acknowledge the importance of peers, both intentional and unintentional opportunities for peers to interact and support each other in this space, and that this is a primary space where these skills are practiced. So we wanted to acknowledge the full range of places where there are opportunities for learning and development.
And I've heard you say, even on that one, it's the in-person peer interaction, but also the virtual.
Yeah, and that's virtual. Yeah, so that is very much, and that's on the minds of lots of educators, not just peer interaction face-to-face, but positive and negative, what happens in cyberspace. The second thing that we then, as we started this conversation, and we did this conversation both with the organizations in the youth development working group, but also with K-12 folks, was to acknowledge that when you start to name the kinds of places where learning and development can happen, where you have learning opportunities, the ones that are sort of in the shaded orange are places that are typically associated with the school and in the school building, working our way down. But every space inside the school isn't equal in terms of that explicit versus sort of climate and culture versus embedded instruction. All those are not the same. And so if you're thinking, for example, about a middle school, you've got core academic classes in which you're really leading with content and leading with required content. And so if the curriculum that's being used isn't one that has sort of embedded in it social and opportunities for social and emotional skill building, it may be a challenge for those teachers to figure out how to bring this in. And that's one of the discussions that the practice group had to have. How do you do that? Then you can go to elective classes. I'm going to take art. I'm going to take band, where there's more room to acknowledge the relationships, those skill building activities. They're informal spaces where social emotional learning and cognitive learning and the use of those skills can be practiced. They can be taught, but they can also be practiced in those spaces. And then you go to extracurricular, the things that are happening outside of school, but are supported by school. So one thing that was important was to acknowledge that every space inside of school isn't the same. The other thing that was very important for the youth development folks that they wanted to acknowledge is they are often in these spaces, as are sometimes family members, that those spaces have organizations like Playworks coming in to really help teachers and staff understand how to really bring this kind of skill building explicitly into recess, into informal spaces. You have organizations like Communities in Schools that literally work in the school building during the school day supporting these things. So that concept that all these organizations wait for young people to come out of the building at the end of the day, we wanted to sort of debunk that and talk about opportunities for expanding the overlap and the connection between folks coming out of those different settings from home to school to community into the building during the day, as well as acknowledging the nuance in the settings. Mm-hmm. And then the same was true in the settings in the community. Some of those are very explicit settings for enrichment and development of skill building, whether that's arts programs, it's sports programs, it's programs that are engaging young people civically, so civic and employment opportunities in which you want young people to be building and practicing those skills. And then community learning settings like libraries, which are often sort of called free choice learning, museums, zoos, parks. All of those are learning opportunities and spaces where there are often adults working with young people. And that entire sort of ecosystem, or that ring of ecosystem of opportunities needs to be acknowledged. So the graphic, as in all of the commission's graphics, went through multiple things. The thing I think that came back to be so central in this, and then I'll pause and see if we've got questions, and Priscilla wants to add to it, was coming back to really put family in the middle of that whole space. Because what we know is that when families have the time and resources, what they want to do is really actively monitor and make choices about all of those environments for their young people. They recognize intuitively the importance of their young people having opportunities for growth and development in a variety of settings in school and out. And parents will come in and actively advocate for specific teachers for their young people, as well as picking certain classes. If they need to, they'll change schools. They also obviously play an active role in selecting the settings in the community where their young people play and build these skills. Mm-hmm. So we also just wanted to put in the middle, and then obviously as young people get older, they make these choices themselves. We wanted to put families and young people in the middle of that picture and basically suggest the value of broadening the picture of where and when learning happens, highlighting the role that families and young people as they get older themselves play in making choices about where and when learning happens and what they do in those settings, and then underscore that if we're really doing it well, there's not just isolation between home, school, and community, but the adults from those spaces are moving in and out.
Yeah, it underscores that children and youth don't grow up in programs, they grow up in families and communities, and that sense of agency of both families and young people in terms of figuring out that picture. So got the importance of families. Priscilla, you said you'd been working on school community partnerships even before the time that you came to work with us at the forum. How is this conversation, a picture like this, useful for those conversations between schools and their community partners?
I think it's useful because it really opens up as soon as you move beyond how learning happens to where and when, a lot more people can see themselves having responsibility for how learning happens. And so I already have been using, even before we got this diagram finalized, although, you know, I think it's still in a good draft form. I think we all agree we have more work we could do on it. But the concept of where and when learning happens when I'm working in communities resonates really well, and it opens a conversation to all the places where young people could name and practice social emotional learning, and really helps you figure out, are these settings conducive to that? And so, as Karen said, we have community partners who come in during the school building to do youth development work, like a PlayWorks. We have communities in schools that partners closely with schools. We have AmeriCorps members coming in during the school day and after school. And this where and when frame really helps more people see and feel responsible for young people's growth and development. And I would just also add that our first version of this diagram did not have the peer icon. And Marita, when you asked what's the value of doing this collaborative process, our collaborators in the youth development work group said, young people spend a lot of time with their peers, either with adults or without adults, but the peer context is really important for how learning happens. And so that was something that we added in that we might have come to on our own, but it was really the fact that icon was really definitely contributed to by the work group, I think, is another value of having this kind of collaborative brain trust working on something.
Terrific. I do want to be able to come back and talk to you both about what next. Like, what are you hoping people will do with this this report and the work? But I want to check in, Ian, and just see, do we have any questions or comments that are coming in?
Yep, there are 3 questions that have come in so far. The first is by Jane Crothers, who's been pretty actively tweeting about today's session as well. Thank you very much, Jane. Her question is learning how to learn part of this process, since what we learn today may be obsolete or outdated in the future workforce and skills building?
If I think I understand the question, basically learning how to learn is critical. I mean, what young people are building and what we're emphasizing is that the specific content that we sort of call academic content, that's what changes most rapidly. But the skills that allow young people to be fully engaged, that move them towards a sense of agency, and if we put up one more slide from the commission, why these skills are important is that they really help young people sort of own and develop their own sense of identity, develop their sense of values, of where they fit and how they fit into the community, and they then help them have a sense of agency, that whatever is changing out there in the world, they're able to do problem solving, they're able to really think critically about where to go, and they're able to chart their course for future learning. So these core capacities are critical, and research has demonstrated that they're critical. And I would say the other thing that's important is to acknowledge, and Priscilla mentioned the importance of engaging the business community. When folks in the business community are sort of interviewed about what they're looking for in the current and future workforce, it's these skills. It's not content, because content gets outdated. They're basically saying, we can teach the content specific, or we can teach the skills, the technical skills specific to the work that we want folks to do. But what young people need to come much better able to demonstrate is this complex set of skills that allow them to work as a part of a team, to do planning, to do time management, to be engaged, to communicate well. Those are the kinds of skills that young people need to have to be prepared for their present and the future.
It's helpful. Priscilla, anything to add, or how would you answer that question?
I would have built on the workforce piece as increasingly when I'm working in communities and the business particularly is saying, why should I be funding after school programs? Why should I be supporting an out of school time intermediary to do this work? When you help them understand that after school and youth development is a workforce issue and the skills that we're talking about are workforce skills, people really just immediately understand that.
This is what we're helping to make happen. Ian, you have another question for us?
This one comes from Nancy Housel, and the question is, how is the efficacy or how is the work of the commission being measured? She says that this is an incredible body of work, so how do we know what we are doing is making a difference or making an impact?
I love that question because the what do you hope is going to happen? What do you think is happening already, and what do you hope is going to happen is what we wanted to get into today.
Yeah, I mean, commissions, as is always the case, are really only as good as what happens next. And then the commission is actively in, and the commissioners and the staff are actively in the process of planning the transition from we are rapidly completing the body of consensus building studies and reports and meetings and engagement opportunities, which I think basically the success of those is demonstrated in not just the volume of reports, but in the amount of consensus and consistency and the integration of those reports and in the reception so far, just as the reception to this. So from the perspective of, are we confident that the commission has done a good job around consensus building, around an integrated set of ideas to push policy and research and practice out, not just within K-12, but to really get it amplified in this broader ecosystem? I think we're pretty confident that the commission has done a good job. Will these things actually change the way leaders inside of K-12 and out do business is the next question. And I'm going to ask you all to stay tuned to wait for the official response from the commission on what's being put in place to basically sort of guide the work from planning into implementation. But I will let you know that that things are being put in place to maintain the momentum and help folks take these ideas and run with them.
So I do want to come back and get a little bit more both from you, Karen, and from Priscilla on the what next and hopes for this. But Ian, let's get that third question on the table.
Okay, this last one is more in the context of kind of deeper level brain development. I'm getting back to it. To provide the entire question, this is from Sherry Williams. I wonder if you might have a response to a question that Mark Tucker raised in a recent issue in Education Week. Tucker claims that cognitive science has invalidated the classical learning theories of Vygotsky, Dewey, and Piaget. What is your thinking? Has brain-based learning theory taken over the concept of meaning making through the social processes of interaction with youth, their schools, and their communities?
Priscilla, you want to start?
So I am not a brain researcher. Let's just start right there. But I think the work that Sol, the science of learning and development, is doing around brain research and integrating that research into the more cognitive lines of research is exactly the direction to go. I don't think it's an either-or situation. I have not read the article by Tucker, so I can't speak to that. But I think what we now know is there are multiple bodies of evidence that need to converge, and I think that was, you'll see in the report from the Nation, a wonderful diagram that really helps us understand how psychology, neuroscience, biology, psychology, all those different disciplines are now converging into the same set of ideas around how learning happens and what it takes to develop the skills, attitudes, and mindsets to be an effective learner. So to me, it's a convergence of research. It's not an either or.
Yeah, and my sense is if these conversations wouldn't even have been able to happen like this a few years ago without the advances in our understanding of the brain research. So I'm not sure if that's getting to the question in terms of how it's carried forward into her pedagogy and some of the specifics, but it does seem like sometimes I had somebody ask me the other day, it's like, why if this is such a galvanizing idea and so consensus building, why haven't we already done this? Why aren't we already there? And I do think that some of the recent work and how learning happens, what we know from the brain research, it helped people come to this conversation, I think, in a different way. So I do want to just kind of wrap a little bit with okay, this was a lot of work. This was a lot to be able to, and a lot of the things upon the parts of a lot of different people that invested hours, days of time, really being able to shape this thinking, shape these ideas, look through all of the research, do all of this. What do you hope's going to happen? What is next?
Again, stay tuned for what is next from the commission itself as it transitions from this particular configuration of commissioners and working groups sort of completing their task into a sort of an implementation phase of supporting people taking the recommendations and the examples out and amplifying them. But I'll bring it back home, back to the forum itself. And this has been, I mean, you said hours and days, Rita. I would certainly say it's more like weeks and months. The Forum for Youth Investment, with me as a commissioner, with Priscilla, with Rita, sort of really doubling down and weighing in this space. There were really selfish reasons for us doing that, just to be perfectly blunt, and I'll let you go to the last slide, Rita. And that is that as an organization that has always sort of started with young people and families in the middle and tried to talk about what it takes to make sure young people that we're really engaging family, school, and community fully in an integrated way to make sure that people are ready for college, work, and life. We have really talked sort of incessantly about the importance of broadening the definition of readiness beyond just academics, broadening the definition of quality beyond just the quality of the content to really acknowledge the quality of the context in which learning and development happens, and then also really taking a hard look at that last word on the slide of equity. Are we making sure that young people have all the opportunities and have equitable opportunities to get to equal outcomes, because we are really doing a good job of not just hoping things are out there for them, but using every resource we can to come back and ask whether we're putting the right kind of opportunities in place with sufficient quality, with sufficient quantity, and acknowledging, you know, sort of cultural and social and other differences in how we know young people happen. Are we doing that? And so those big ideas are the ideas that are the themes behind our work. For us, very explicitly, being able to wrap those ideas literally around this new sort of sanctioned consensus definition and graphic around where and when learning happens, lets us just be explicit about asking those questions. So we know young people all show up in schools, and you can track attendance, but tracking attendance is not the best way, and certainly not the only way, to just ask whether all young people are getting sort of, you know, equal access to learning, because we need to come inside to talk about the quality of what they're getting. The more the commission's work, the more the work that we've been able to do and the partnerships we've been able to build have allowed us to bring that broader definition of quality, the quality of the learning environment, whether that learning environment is porous enough to really support social and emotional and cognitive development, and to give young people a range of experiences is important. So we've got that. And then from an equity perspective, we also know that when you step outside of the building, it isn't just the quality of what happened during the day, and not just the quality of what happened in the core academic courses, but in all those other spaces where learning happens. I'm now stepping out into a space in which learning opportunities are much more voluntary, are often fee-based, and definitely are not equal from one neighborhood to the next. And so what we're hoping for, frankly, is, and have seen, is a greater appetite on the part of communities and specifically on the part of K-12 to not sort of own that whole space, but to understand the importance of having data against the whole space. Because if we really do understand and can explain the differences between a young person who's attending a school in which those core academic classes may not be fully there and fully present because they're being taught by substitute teachers or they don't have AP classes, through to the different environments that are happening inside the school, to now measuring access and quality outside of the school, we've got a very different picture of what we're talking about when we have to tackle the question of getting to equity and learning opportunities. So being able to really have a new way to engage, specifically engage sort of K-12 educators with community leaders in conversation about how to really make sure we're taking full advantage of the partnerships that are possible in this where and when learning happens, to take advantage of what we know about how, for us is a really exciting opportunity, and we're looking forward to the next phase of the Commission's work as we move these recommendations out to being as an equally active partner in the implementation.
Excellent. I mean, it really is a lens that helps sharpen our understanding and put an edge on those conversations. So I'm gonna just, Ian, if I may, just ask Karen and Priscilla to very briefly say, for those who are listening, for those who pick up the report, what do you hope they'll do? Priscilla.
So I think we've said a lot of what we hope that they will do with it. I think I'm hoping it will help people who pick up the report have a broader understanding of all the opportunity and missed opportunity there is to support young people's growth and development, and really have a broader and richer conversation about that. I also think on a smaller level, what I would love for this report to do is help communities and districts understand the value of having an out-of-school time intermediary or network or system that can support this kind of relationship building. When I think about what Karen just said about the data, most out-of-school time systems are poised and ready to give you support on where young people are spending their time in the out-of-school hours. So I think there's leverage there. Most out-of-school time systems are also really committed to program quality, and there's an opportunity to learn from them and help them scale quality practices throughout other youth development organizations. So I think both the opportunity to have the conversation and then to think about how could I use an out-of-school time network in my community to really deepen the where and the when are the two things I would hope happen.
Helpful, thank you. And Karen, anything to add?
Yeah, I will echo everything that Priscilla just said and add two suggestions. One, I really do encourage you to look at the examples. The more we really sort of can go from the general to the specific, the more we'll understand and get excited about the kinds of things that could happen. We had two panels of examples when we did the release event a couple weeks ago, and you can go back and listen to that live. The second thing that I would encourage people to do is just sit down with a couple of young people and ask them where learning happens. Pull out the picture or just have it in your head and have that conversation, because when you talk to young people and you understand the importance of all of these settings for their experiences, and we understand that any instruction that happens explicitly in a social emotional class can be undone when adults don't track with equal intentionality what's happening in the cafeteria or the hallways or the playgrounds or the neighborhood. We get a deeper sense of, from a young person's perspective and from a family's perspective that's trying to support this work, how important it is for us to be more intentional in watching this bigger space.
Thank you. Priscilla, Karen, thank you for this invigorating conversation. Ian, back to you.
Well, again, thank you very much. Thank you, Marita, for the excellent moderation of today's session. We are considering today's conversation part of a longer series of exploring both the brief and the work of the Youth Development Work Group, as well as the many great ideas that have come through, many in the graphics today. So please stay tuned. The next event will be a Twitter chat, an online session to really kind of play and explore with these ideas in a more two-sided way, and that'll be 2 weeks from today, Friday, December 14th. So please stay tuned for more information about that. So again, thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon and weekend. There are plenty of kudos coming in from the Twitter chat to all of you. So thank you again, Karen, Marita, and Priscilla, for such a great conversation today.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Philip. Bye.